A simple woman was laughed at the moment she stepped onto the mat. Her GI pants were frayed at the hem, her belt a dull brown stitched by hand, and her canvas bag looked like it had survived 100 wash cycles. One fighter smirked, nudging his friend. Who let the cleaning crew sign up? Another added loud enough to make two scouts chuckle without looking up from their clipboards. They saw her as background noise in a room built for contenders with six-pack abs, branded fight gear, and 10,000 Instagram followers. No one bothered to ask her name. She said nothing. When Coach Ryan Beck called for volunteers, the room shifted. No one wanted to spar with Cruz Delgado, a flashy pro prospect with a reputation for crushing new entries. She stepped forward. Cruz grinned like he'd been handed a warm-up drill. The bell rang. 14 seconds later, he tapped his arm, extended his shoulders, locked by a transition. Most of the room didn't recognize one that belonged to a lineage they'd forgotten even existed. She reset her belt and returned to kneeling without a word. The room had no idea what to do with the silence. Then a scout from the UFC roster team stepped through the back gate, pointed to her, and said, "Coach Wyatt, we've been looking for you." Apex MMA looked less like a gym and more like the corporate headquarters of violence. The entrance was lined with steel beams and polished glass high-end supplements on marble counters and a wall-sized LED screen looping highlight reels of sponsored fighters. Championship banners fluttered from the ceiling, each boasting a face, a name, and a brand deal. Inside, rows of leather chairs bordered the main training cage where a team of staff circled like stagehands. A cluster of fighters stood near the lockers in neon gear, trading sparring stories while checking their reflections in the mirrored walls. She walked in through the front, her canvas bag slung low over one shoulder, the strap mended with hand stitching. Her GI was folded tightly under one arm, the fabric thinned in places from a decade of use. On her waist hung a brown belt, faded and fraying at the edges. It's not softened by repetition. She didn't glance at the banners, didn't pause to absorb the platinum gleam of the custom cages or the rows of protein bars priced like fine wine. She walked straight toward the reception desk and offered a quiet, "Even I'm here for the advanced trial session." The receptionist, a tall young man with a manicured beard and a logo-cut shirt, barely glanced up from his iPad. He looked her over slowly, eyes moving from her taped pants to her scuffed shoes. Trials for fighters with rank or fight history. No beginners. She gestured to her belt without blinking. Brown belt, 15 years training. He raised a brow but handed her a waiver. "Suit yourself. Locker rooms are through the back." As she signed, she used her mother's last name, Collins, not Wyatt. It kept things simple. In the women's locker room, the air was dense with perfume and tension. Her best friend Rachel posed as a maintenance tech and wiped down a mirror, her phone tucked discreetly under a towel, recording. A few women in matching compression wear stretched along the wall, stealing looks at her gear. One, already in gloves, leaned to another and whispered loud enough to be heard, "She thrift that G or win it in a raffle." The other chuckled and said, "Some kind of Zen throwback, maybe. We'll see if she lasts past warm-ups." She didn't answer. She sat quietly, slipped off her shoes, and began changing. The white towel she used to wipe down her feet had her grandfather's initials stitched into the hem. She'd done the needlework herself after he passed. He'd trained her in the family garage for years. No cameras, no medals, no Instagram posts. Just principles, repetition, and one promise to keep the art clean when it got commercialized. He'd asked her on his last day, "If the sport forgets what it means, will you remember?" She left her black belt wrapped in cloth at home. It wasn't a test of skill today, it was a test of culture. She was here not to prove herself, but to document how this space treated outsiders, women, and people who didn't lead with flash. The Apex trial was public-facing now, with video crew scouts and an influencer wing. Rachel's footage would be added to a presentation on modern gatekeeping in combat sports. They weren't trying to shame anyone, they were gathering stories. Hers just happened to be the next one. On the way to the mat, she passed the trophy wall. There were names she recognized, fighters who used to come through her grandfather's garage for quiet training when they wanted to correct a flaw they couldn't admit in public. No one ever posted about it, but she remembered their kindness. Here, though, the names were different. Louder. Fighters with brand logos on their shorts, agents in tow, and nicknames carved into the plaques. The gym's motto hung on the opposite wall: "Respect is earned, not given." She'd always thought that was backward. When she stepped onto the mat, the texture caught her slicker than she liked, probably oiled for camera shine. Coach Ryan Beck stood in the center, barking instructions. He was taller than she remembered from the fight archives, broader now, with veins standing out on his forearms, like cables. He glanced her way, did a double take, then turned back to the group. She was just another warm body. She looked around the room. Most of the students were men, big, loud, confident. They wore matching rash guards or gear with team logos. One stood out, Cruz Delgado, a middleweight who'd just signed with a regional UFC feeder. He shadowboxed between drills, his grin sharp, his energy loud. When he looked her way, he smirked, then looked past her like she was scenery. She adjusted her belt and knelt by the edge of the mat. Rachel caught her eye from the corner. Camera running. She nodded once. The test had begun. She didn't even make it past the front desk before the first dismissal. As she stepped inside, the receptionist gave her a once-over eyes trailing from the scuffed soles of her shoes to the fraying hem of her GI pants. He tilted his head, clearly trying to place her. "Cleaning staff's usually here in the mornings," he said with a polite but unmistakably flat tone. She stood still for a beat, then replied evenly, "I'm here for the advanced sparring session." The pause that followed wasn't long, but it was loud with implication. He blinked, then gave a dry chuckle, tapping his stylus against a clipboard. "Right. Trials for competitive fighters. You probably want the intro class down the side hall, first door past cardio." She didn't blink. "I'm a brown belt," she said. The receptionist squinted, rechecking his screen, then shrugged and muttered, "Suit yourself." As she passed, she heard him murmur under his breath, "Got one of the cosplay types today." In the locker room, the lights were bright, the tiles pristine, the air thick with the mingled scents of eucalyptus and engineered body spray. She chose a corner bench away from the cluster of women prepping with Bluetooth earbuds and color-coordinated wraps. One looked up, narrowed her eyes at the stitched brown belt in the side pouch of her gym bag, and leaned toward a teammate. "Another one," she said softly, not softly enough. They really letting anybody in here now. Another woman, arms looped in resistance bands, glanced over and smirked. "You some TikTok self-defense girl?" she asked. One of those how to tap out an attacker with one finger types. The chuckle that followed wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. The room didn't exactly freeze her out, it just made space around her like water pulling away from a dropped stone. She said nothing. She folded her towel slowly, the one with her grandfather's initials stitched into the edge, and began wrapping her wrists. Her hands moved with quiet precision, the kind earned from long hours of practice in a garage where the only witness was dust and discipline. One of the women glanced at the towel, paused, then turned away without comment. Another muttered, "This place doesn't do belts past blue for women unless you're already famous." Just saying. She nodded once and kept wrapping. Her GI top was faded along the collar, but still held shape, the result of careful care. She pulled it on with practiced ease, each movement deliberate. Her belt, tucked neatly into the bottom of her bag, remained untouched. That would come later. For now, she needed to get through the next hour without being pushed to the fringe. She wasn't surprised. She'd been warned about Apex, its obsession with image, its preference for branded success over quiet skill, its open-door policy that still closed on the wrong faces. On her way to the mat area, she passed the trophy wall again. The names gleamed in etched chrome, glossy and cold. Beneath each was a quote about grit, drive, legacy. She scanned them without reading. A glass case nearby displayed a row of custom gloves, each signed by Apex's top earners, each backed by a different brand. The walls didn't inspire her, they advertised. Her footsteps were soft on the foam walkway leading to the cage. She repeated her grandfather's phrase under her breath like a shield mat as truth. Near the edge of the main mat, two male fighters laughed about a viral clip from last week's seminar. One pointed at her bag as she approached. "Somebody forget to bring her fighter," he joked. His friend barked out a laugh. "She's got the belt, but none of the frame." She adjusted her grip on the canvas strap and gave them a nod that didn't ask for a response. Rachel caught her eye from a side alcove, wiping down a section of padding with a cloth and nodding toward her pocket, still recording. The space buzzed around her with bravado and kinetic noise, but she felt it all at a distance, like watching it unfold through glass. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. This was the gauntlet she'd expected. It was why she left her real belt at home. Not everyone needed to know where she came from. Only the mat needed reminding. Coach Ryan Beck stood in the center of the mat like he owned gravity. His walk was slow, heavy-shouldered, confident in a way that didn't invite questions. He clapped twice, loud and sharp, the sound echoing against the gym's steel rafters. "All right, we're working out a turtle," he announced, eyes scanning the half-circle of fighters, already kneeling on the padded floor. Submissions from back control. Transitions into leg traps. I need someone who won't snap in half if I lock up tight. His gaze paused on her like he'd found the perfect tool for a demo not too small, not too important. She rose quietly and stepped forward, offering no expression as the group shifted their weight to watch. Her GI brushed the mat with a soft rustle, the fabric catching on the friction-rough floor. Coach Beck didn't bother introducing her. He nodded toward her belt like it was a prop and motioned her to kneel. "Brown belt, huh? We'll see." He crouched behind her, positioning her in turtle with an offhand grip on her elbow. "Just stay loose. It'll be quick." The first sequence was textbook. He secured a seatbelt grip and showed the motion to roll into a leg hook. She let him move her, tracking the pressure in her ribs, her shoulder, her breathing staying steady. The mat warmed beneath her knees. He reset this time quicker, locking the choke a little tighter. She coughed lightly but said nothing. "See," he said to the class. "Too easy. No real structure here." A few people chuckled. She adjusted her hips as he pulled again, but not enough to counter. Her goal was survival, not challenge. Beck's next move was sharper, a wrist trap compressed into a neck crank. She stiffened for a second, then let it ride. He released and turned to the class. "That's how you dominate an overranked opponent. You feel that tension, brown belt's gotta offer more than passive resistance." His tone wasn't cruel, just casual authority, but it landed like sandpaper. She kept her gaze low, eyes flicking once to the far corner where Rachel stood with a cleaning cloth, her phone angled just right beneath it, still filming. Beck demonstrated again, this time speeding up. His grip found her GI collar tugging harder than was necessary. The embroidered patch inside her collar scratched against her neck, a small cloth rectangle, initials faded but clear. NW. Her grandfather's legacy, stitched by hand. She exhaled slowly as he jerked her into side control and dropped his weight. "This is what pressure feels like," Beck said, pinning her with his chest and shifting his hips to exaggerate control. Her GI flattened beneath her, its fibers sliding across the chalk-dusted mat. She braced with her forearms, giving just enough resistance to avoid looking limp, not enough to make it a contest. Her ribs ached, but her breath stayed quiet. He tightened the crossface, his forearm pressing into her jaw. "Real defense starts with frames." He continued loud enough for the back row. "Not whatever this is." He tapped her shoulder, sharp, dismissive, then stood. "All right, she'll stay in for another few reps. Cruz, come up. Let's run it again with some resistance." As Cruz stepped in, Beck leaned down to her ear and muttered, "Don't worry. I'll let him go light." He didn't say it loud, but the smirk on his face said enough. The class chuckled. One fighter near the edge lifted his phone, capturing the next angle. She reset her knees under her and nodded at Cruz. He moved like a showman, flashy quick, too relaxed for real control. When he wrapped around her back and went for a choke, he whispered, "Hope you're flexible, yoga lady." The squeeze was firm, not cruel, but she felt the dig underneath. She let it ride. His next transition was sloppy but aggressive, his knee jamming into her hip, his hand bunching her GI across the stomach. Beck clapped once. "Good. Turn that corner harder. Show them what it looks like when someone wants the tap." She didn't flinch. Her breathing remained controlled, her jaw clenched behind silence. The mat scuffed beneath her shoulder as Cruz pushed off, switching sides with exaggerated flair. "She's not even framing," someone said from the side. "Just folding like a paper towel." Beck nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes to expose the gap." He grabbed her sleeve and yanked it into position again. "Let's try it from mount this time. Less wriggle room." She moved to position her GI, bunching at the waist, sweat now visible under the collar. The floor's rubber texture caught the heel of her foot as she bridged, slightly instinct-contained. Beck didn't give her room. His leg pressed across her chest as he postured for the camera. "This is how you isolate someone with no hips." he said, driving his weight down unnecessarily. Her breath escaped in a quiet exhale. Rachel shifted slightly across the room, still filming, still silent. The final sequence was rushed. Beck wanted a clean finish for the onlookers and shouted, "Arm triangle transition, watch the elbow track." He slid her into the choke with too much speed. Her vision narrowed for half a second before she angled her chin, just right, bought herself air, and waited. The tap never came, because it wasn't real training. It was theater. She knew that now. When he stood, he wiped his hands on his shorts and gave her a half-hearted pat. "That's enough for now. Good sport." She nodded, once returned to kneeling and stared straight ahead while the class laughed and moved on to the next drill. Her face stayed calm, but the air in her chest felt heavier than before. And still she said nothing. Coach Beck clapped his hands and raised his voice over the low buzz of students breaking from drills. "Winner stays in. Light contact to start, then flow into live rounds. If you're tapped, step off. Let's go." A ripple of energy moved through the class. Fighters adjusted their gear, cracked their necks, and circled the mat. Beck's eyes skimmed the group until they landed on her. "You," he said, pointing. "You're up first." Then he turned to Cruz Delgado. "Make it quick." Cruz smiled like he'd just been handed dessert. He was already bouncing on his toes, his body language exaggerated for the crowd. "Tap early, all right," he called across the mat. "Yoga girl in a GI. Not trying to ruin your spa day." The class chuckled, some half-laughing, others watching more closely now. Her face didn't change. She stepped onto the mat, bowed once, and took her stance low, composed, not aggressive. They circled briefly. Cruz feinted a quick jab, then shot in with an easy double leg. She didn't sprawl, didn't resist. She let the takedown happen, cushioning the fall with her shoulder, tucking her chin. He landed on top and immediately moved to knee on belly, his weight exaggerated, driving his shin into her stomach. "Come on, coach," said Light, someone joked from the side. Cruz winked and shifted forward. She moved her hips enough to relieve pressure, but still stayed within the rhythm of compliant sparring. He postured back, hands framing her biceps, then slid into a loose mount. His hands played with collar grips, not establishing real control, just crowding her space. She kept her breathing even. Her fingers framed subtly at his hips, ready to escape if needed. But for now, she allowed the performance to continue. "Is this all she's got?" Cruz called out, grinning. "I thought brown belts were supposed to fight back." More laughter. Someone near the cage shouted, "Maybe it's taupe. Discount rank." She heard it, filed it away, and kept her eyes half-lidded, tracking his hips instead of his voice. Coach Beck's tone cut through the laughter. "Break her guard," he said, not loudly but with edge. "Let her feel what this level really is." Cruz didn't wait for further instruction. He dropped low, postured up, and slammed his elbow against the inside of her thigh, not hard enough to injure, but enough to jolt. She grunted under her breath and reclosed her legs, adjusting her guard. He shook his head in mock sympathy. "Might want to work on flexibility. Those old joints don't move like they used to." He began stacking her legs high, pushing forward with his shoulder to compress her core. His forearm found her throat, not a choke, just pressure, and stayed there a moment too long. She shifted her hips, not to escape, but to breathe. He let up slightly, then came down harder with a crossface. The edge of his forearm pressed against her jaw, twisting her neck. The motion wasn't illegal, but it wasn't clean either. Still, she didn't respond. She adjusted her spine against the mat, eyes watching the ceiling hands resting near his biceps. She could have escaped, could have bridged and swept. But she didn't. Not yet. Not while Rachel's camera still recorded from across the room, propped under a sweatshirt on the edge of the cage. Cruz exhaled loudly, annoyed. "You even awake in there," he muttered. "Tap if you're bored." His voice dipped low, meant just for her. "Or maybe you're used to this, getting crushed by better fighters." Her ribs ached from the weight. Her shoulder tensed from his pressure. Her left hand twitched, once her fingertips brushing the mat. He tried a wrist lock, next sloppy but forceful. Her hand bent, tension rising along her forearm. She rotated her arm with just enough subtlety to nullify the hold without resistance. Cruz leaned in closer, voice smug. "Bet you were decent 20 pounds ago." A few heads turned at the comment. One student near the cage frowned slightly but didn't speak. Coach Beck stepped to the edge of the mat. "Cruz," he said. "Get something done, or switch." Cruz nodded and changed tactics. He moved back to knee on belly, then spun to take her back. His hooks weren't clean, but his weight dragged her off center. His hand slapped for a choke, again loose, then rougher. She let him find the collar, let him get just close enough to commit. Then she adjusted her chin, tucking it against the grip, and waited. "Damn," someone whispered. "She's just letting him cook." Rachel shifted position across the room, still filming. Cruz growled under his breath and pulled harder. Her hand reached to frame his wrist, not to escape, not yet, just to control the line. She felt his frustration building. His movement was getting less technical. He rolled them abruptly, trying to reset, but overcompensated and lost a hook. She let him scramble back, gave him a chance to regroup. He mounted again and went for pressure, this time a sharp shoulder crossface, the kind that made teeth click together. Her lip pressed into her molar's breath, slow through her nose. She didn't tap. She didn't move. A ring of chalk had started to form beneath her left elbow, where it stayed braced lightly against the mat. Her eyes didn't blink. Coach Beck said nothing now. He watched from the edge, arms crossed. Cruz gave one last push, going for a head-arm trap. It was wide open. She felt the angle, the commitment. She knew what came next, and she knew he didn't. Her fingers flexed just slightly beneath his hip. She closed her eyes and whispered the words in her mind like a quiet liturgy. Not yet. Not yet. But soon. Her shoulder burned as Cruz locked in the grip, his weight shifting forward elbow deep, rotating her arm just past safe resistance. It wasn't a clean Kimura. It was a warning wrapped in technique, a message layered inside the motion. Her fingers trembled slightly from the pressure. He adjusted again, slow and deliberate, giving her just enough time to recognize the threat without offering mercy. The coach didn't say a word. He stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable, eyes fixed on the hold like a spectator watching a film he'd already seen. Around the mat, the class had quieted. The tension had shifted no longer. Curiosity now, a growing discomfort, a collective question none of them voiced. Was this still sparring, or was it spectacle? Her breathing shortened. The torque increased. She could feel the fine line between stretch and damage. A bead of sweat traced a line along her temple. She thought of her grandfather, not in a burst of emotion, but as a grounding presence, as steady as his voice had been every time he corrected her grips. The mat doesn't lie. But sometimes you must choose if it should speak. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, gaze fixed on the mat beside her. It wasn't pride that made her stay silent. It wasn't even pain. It was a deeper calculation, the quiet knowledge that some moments need to be answered, not with force, but with form. If she allowed this to continue, she might be injured. If she fought back in anger, she would prove nothing. The truth had to be clean, undeniable, and simple. Her hand slipped from the grip. Her hips shifted subtly. She planted her right foot, anchoring against the mat just behind his knee. It was not an escape. Not yet. It was a pivot, a signal only she understood, like a lever easing into place before pressure could be applied. The motion changed nothing to the class, but everything to her. Cruz didn't notice at first. He was too focused on the crank, too convinced of her compliance to realize what had just happened. His balance began to shift without him realizing. She adjusted her frame, breathing in, not with defiance, but with precision. It wasn't time to submit him. Not yet. But it was time to stop pretending. She'd honored the test, endured the theater, and upheld her silence. Now it was the mat's turn to speak. The pressure in her shoulder ebbed as she redirected the force. Her knee slipped into place behind his elbow, hidden beneath his weight. The next move was a whisper. Not violence, not resistance, just alignment. The class stayed quiet. The coach still didn't speak. Rachel's phone stayed steady from across the gym. Her knuckles pressed into the floor tape, rough against her skin. Her breath slowed again. This wasn't retaliation. It was truth preparing its voice. The next sequence would not be loud. It would not be angry. It would be clean. And he would never see it coming. Cruz shifted forward to tighten the Kimura, but the moment he committed his weight, she moved. It wasn't explosive. It was a sequence so fluid, so practiced, it looked like water choosing a different course. Her hips angled, her knee slipped inside the frame of his elbow. and with one smooth pivot, she inverted beneath him, her legs threading into position as if the mat itself had whispered the path. His grip loosened before he even realized he'd lost it. She caught his wrist and extended his arm knees tight to his side. The pressure was immediate, exact, not forced. His hand hovered above the mat for half a breath before he slapped twice. Tap, tap. 14 seconds. Her grip eased at once. She didn't hold it long enough to humiliate, only long enough to prove. She rolled out of the hold and returned to her knees, back straight, eyes lowered. Her breathing was steady. Her belt frayed at the edge where it tied around her waist. The class had fallen silent. No jokes, no comments, no laughter. Just the sound of their shifting posture and the faint hiss of sweat drying on vinyl. Cruz sat up slowly, rubbing his elbow, blinking like he'd just walked through a door he didn't see. His face wasn't angry, just stunned like the air had left the room and returned in a new shape. He didn't speak. No one did. Coach Beck stared from the edge of the mat, his expression unreadable. His arms had dropped from his chest. His mouth parted slightly, not in protest, but in disbelief. He looked at her like he'd missed something, like he was trying to rewind the last minute in his head and figure out how it had happened without noise, without warning. She bowed her forehead, dipping toward the mat, then stood and stepped backward to the line, letting the next pair take position. Her GI brushed softly as she moved the sound of cloth on floor, louder now than anything else. The mat where Cruz had tapped still held the faint imprint of her elbow. The chalk ring where her arm had been was slightly smudged. Rachel's phone was still recording from the corner, unmoved, unnoticed. No one clapped. No one called out her name. But something shifted in the room, subtle and absolute. The posture of those watching changed. The eyes that had dismissed her earlier now held still. One fighter whispered to another, barely audible, "What was that?" The other shook their head slowly. "Never seen that before." She didn't answer. She didn't turn around. She simply knelt again, adjusted her belt with quiet hands, and waited. The silence stretched long enough to say everything. No anger, no victory dance, no explanation. Just the truth laid bare by the mat in the shape of a submission no one could dispute. Coach Beck found her just after the last round ended as the class dispersed and the buzz of idle chatter started to fill the space again. His voice, now stripped of performance, came quieter than it had all day. "Where'd you train?" he asked. Not with challenge this time, but with the uncertainty of a man piecing something together too late. She didn't answer right away. She adjusted the strap on her canvas bag, brushed chalk from the hem of her sleeve, then looked at him with a calm that didn't ask permission. "Nathaniel Wyatt," she said. "He was my grandfather." For a moment, Coach Beck didn't react. His brow twitched and he blinked slowly like the name had come from another era. Then his jaw shifted slightly and his posture changed, not slouched, not defensive, but careful. "Wyatt," he repeated, quieter this time. "As in, the Wyatt." His voice trailed off, but she nodded once to confirm. It didn't need elaboration. The name moved faster than she did. One of the older assistant coaches nearby turned at the sound of it. "Nathaniel Wyatt," he repeated a half-second behind. "No way." Another fighter sitting by the wall, taping his wrists, froze mid-motion. Did she say Wyatt? The noise in the room dipped just enough to notice. Heads turned subtly, eyes recalibrating. Nathaniel Wyatt wasn't famous in the way most were. He had no YouTube channel, no tournament footage, no branded seminars. But people who had rolled with him, those who had trained quietly under him, spoke of him the way you speak of a rare book passed hand to hand. He had taught out of a converted barn, refused payment more often than not, and was known for submissions that didn't make highlight reels, but left people thinking about pressure differently for the rest of their lives. She had worn his belt today, though no one had noticed. The stitching along the edge was uneven, repaired in places, the ends soft from time. It had meant nothing an hour ago. Now it carried a lineage the gym hadn't accounted for. Coach Beck stood silent. He didn't apologize. He didn't speak again. But the look in his eyes wasn't just recognition, it was adjustment. A slow turning of the lens that reframed everything he'd seen. And not just from her. She didn't press the moment. She didn't explain. She walked to the corner where Rachel waited, still dressed as maintenance, still filming. Rachel tucked the phone away without a word. The two of them exchanged a glance. Nothing else needed to be said. She slung her bag over her shoulder and walked past the wall of championship banners without looking up. No one followed. No one stopped her. The mat still held the echo of her presence, but she left no trace. Only a name, and the silence it carried. 6 months later, the gym looked the same at first glance. Same steel beams, same championship banners overhead. But the air had changed. The name was different now. Painted across the wall in modest matte lettering was a new title, Wyatt Apex. Beneath it hung a simple white banner with black stitching that read, "Matt is Truth." The cage was still in the center of the space, but today it echoed with smaller voices and slower drills. Coach Beck stood near the edge of the mats, not barking orders but guiding a group of young girls through shrimping drills. His tone was measured, his movements deliberate. He corrected their posture with the ease of someone learning to teach, not just demonstrate. He wore no logo today, only a plain, rash guard and a quiet focus. He clapped gently when one girl finally moved her hips with the right form and said, "Good. That's it. Now do it again." In one corner, Rachel adjusted a tripod and checked the recording angle on a practice interview. She was on staff now managing community outreach, helping to bring in students from local schools and youth centers. Flyers hung on the bulletin board by the water cooler, free self-defense clinics, parent-daughter workshops, classes designed not around belt promotions, but around safety and trust. Rachel had replaced the sponsorship posters with photos of training sessions, two teenagers laughing mid-roll, a coach helping a student adjust a grip, a row of white belts lined up and listening. The seminar wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't on the website. But the back room filled anyway. Those who came didn't arrive in branded gear or with flashy introductions. They came quietly on referral, on reputation. Some brought questions. Others just brought open hands. She stood at the front in a simple black GI, the belt tied clean at her waist. Embroidered in small thread along the edge were two names, Wyatt, Morgan. She didn't bow in dramatically or make a speech. She waited until the room was ready, then began by kneeling. "Guard retention," she said softly. "Not for points. For safety. For control." Her voice was calm. No one filmed. No one shouted. The room followed her in quiet rhythm, as if learning by proximity. Later, as the mats were rolled back and gear packed away, she walked past the front desk. Behind the glass wall, a new frame had been mounted where the old trophy display had once stood. Inside it was a single photo, her grandfather younger, standing barefoot on a canvas mat, holding a cup of tea and smiling faintly at the camera. No belt visible. Just the man, the moment, and the floor beneath him. Beneath the frame on a small plaque it read, "Founder of Form, Teacher of Teachers." As she passed the lobby, a little girl in an oversized GI waited near the front bench, feet swinging above the floor. Her father helped tighten her belt with patient hands. She looked up at the wall, then at the mat, then at the banner above. The mat was still the same, but the truth it held had a new weight, and this time everyone in the room was invited to listen. She walked in unnoticed, underestimated, and dismissed before she ever touched the mat. What they saw was someone quiet, someone ordinary. What they missed was everything underneath years of discipline, a legacy carried in silence, and a strength that did not need to prove itself. This wasn't a story about fighting for recognition. It was about holding your ground when no one believes you belong. About choosing not to shout, but to show. Her journey reminds us that self-worth does not come from approval, and independence is not always loud. Sometimes the most powerful presence in the room is the one who says the least and does the most. Have you ever seen someone overlooked because they didn't fit in? Or been that person yourself? Let us know in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, follow along for more stories that honor quiet strength and dignity that doesn't ask to be seen.